You mentioned the symbol of the cross, and I didn't grow up with any religion at all, and have subsequently, dove pretty deep into kind of the mystical Kabbalist teachings, and also had a great friend by the name of Ted Decker, who's deep into kind of the more mystical understandings of the teachings of Yeshua. So great admiration for at least the interpretations that have flowed through me that seem to resonate and throw ontologically with me, like feeling in my body, like, oh yeah, that's fucking incredibly wise and true. But the symbol of the cross, for me, has always been a confusing symbol. And it's confusing because it was and I know there may be older versions of the cross, but it's confusing because it was a symbol of torture, right?
Yeah.
And so it's supposed to mean all of these good things, and also, has been used subsequently as an oppressive force, as, knights or warrior, kind of the armed militia of the church has burned and attacked and killed. And so it's a very complex symbol to me. And I was hoping that, I know this is an area of expertise for you to kind of explore. I was hoping you could actually really give us a bit of a deep dive into the symbolism of the cross and how it can be interpreted by so many different people.
So a cross is basically just the meaning of a horizontal and a vertical at the outset, if you want to get down to the geometric aspect of it. But that is actually what makes it important, right? It's a meaning of two things. First of all, it's a meaning of a vertical and a horizontal, which means that it's something like the meaning of heaven and earth is maybe the best way to understand it. So you have vertical relationships. You can understand that as hierarchies or different types of vertical relationships, our relationship to God, relationship to the gods in general, whatever it is you imagine as a vertical relationship, or your relationship to your general, if you're in the army, it's like this, there are vertical relationships. And then there are horizontal reality, which is, let's say, your particular reality as a person who's dealing with all this stuff in the world. And the cross is the place where those two meet, and so you can imagine that the cross is every place where the vertical and the horizontal meet. And you can imagine that, for example, being represented in something like a sacred space, a sacred temple, where there's a theophany at the, in the holiest place of the temple. And then you encounter that, and then you have this contact between me as a person and then a vertical relationship. Now, so that's just the basic symbolism of the cross.
Well, then, if we just pause there for a moment, double click on it, it would seem that then the placement of the intersecting horizontal line is significant, and then also the length of the intersecting horizontal line that changes it from a cross to a plus sign, perhaps, which would show equality between those two energetic kind of symbols, right? Like, so is there in the Christian cross, let's just from a purely geometric, and I think there's some other versions of that makes it a cross and not a plus. Like, what is the symbolism of actually moving that horizontal line higher and shortening it?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that the Christian cross there are many versions of the Christian cross, and so the square cross is a Christian cross. It's probably one of the earliest versions of the Christian cross would have been a square cross, actually. And you can see that if you've ever seen an image of, it says, I see XC Nika, like Jesus Christ conqueror. These were the images that were used in the early Christianity as an image of the cross. And so I think there is specificity to the different types of crosses. There is also a way in which to join the symbolism of the cross with the historical cross. That is to understand that it is a symbol that represents the union of heaven and earth, but the Christian contention is that highest version of that is the cross on which Christ was crucified. And like you said, it seems like a very strange thing because the meeting of heaven and earth is the place where someone's is tortured by the Romans. Like that's where the meeting of heaven and earth is. Like what the hell's going on there? But it's not that complicated to kind of understand. And the world was built in the ancient world was built on sacrifice. There was a sense in which, in order to reach that vertical relationship, you had to give something up. Right? So you have to give something up, and then if you give something up, then you get the protection, you get the strength, you get the relationship with that vertical. We still do that now. It's called paying taxes, right? So you pay taxes up towards the government, and then the government offers you an identity, protection, a connection, and an interconnectivity between each other, right? And so it's not a silly thing. Of course, people, because they don't understand ancient sacrifice anymore, they just think it's superstitious nonsense. But it's like, think about it as paying taxes, right? You pay taxes up, right? And so what the Christian revelation shows is that the ultimate version of that sacrifice is actually self-sacrifice. That in the ancient world, you had the sense in which you would sacrifice other things, right? You would sacrifice, your children or whatever. Like, you'd sacrifice the animals, the children, you'd sacrifice things that are precious to you up towards the gods, and then you would get some kind of protection or some kind of cohesion in exchange. And what the Christian mystery shows is that the ultimate version of that is self-sacrifice. And that's why the cross of Christ becomes like a revelation about how this relationship between the vertical and the horizontal meet. So then you can actually start to apply it at different things. And you think, well, actually, you're right. It is self-sacrifice, which is the real way which heaven and earth bind. So think about anything that you participate in vertically, right? You're a basketball player, you're playing for a basketball team. And so you realize, wait a minute, like, the way for the basketball team to function is I have to give myself to the purpose, to the higher purpose. So there's a higher purpose in this game. Obviously, it's not a super high spiritual purpose, but it is a higher purpose, right? Because it's what's binding us together. That's why we exist as a team. And so I give myself up. And if I do that, then I get the most out of the world. I get the most out of the team. And then it's like, oh, wait a minute. So I could bind my family together with a scapegoat, and it'll work. Like, if I have 4 kids, one of my kids could be the black sheep, and we could just pile all our problems on that black sheep, blame them for everything, say they're the reason for all our problems. And what it'll do is it'll bind your family together. It'll work. Like, it'll actually work. But it's not the best way to do it. The best way to do it would be something like, as a father, I give myself to my family. And if I do that, then the binding is far more is real. Like, it has more weight. Yeah. And that's why, so it ends up being, the whole image of love becomes the cross. It's like, it's an image of love at the center.
So that makes perfect sense. And I would say that actually there are alternate stories about the way to actually beyond sacrifice as a way to both bind together and to offer yourself in service in a way. And the other side would be pleasure, right? Like, the way to offer yourself in your sexuality is not service. So let's take the act of sexing. It's actually to go find your rapture and share your rapture and share your bliss and share your pleasure. Same with many games that we play, in which it's actually your joy. It's actually your enthusiastic, ecstatic experience, which is the antithesis of sacrifice, which implies pain, or a cross, which implies torture. But it's actually pleasure itself, which then facilitates more pleasure. And in many cases in basketball, I was a basketball player. So in many cases, there are periods where sacrifice is necessary. You got to take that charge. You got to dive for that loose ball. You got to fucking go. You got to go for it, right? But also that kind of the lightness of spirit, that little quick little, you imagine the Jordan wink where he's just smiling and he's like really in the joy of that flow state, is also contagious. And so I think, and this is something that the, Hebrew mysticism points to. They talk about Shekinah, which is an embodiment of what could be called eros, which is like kind of the pleasure of creation, the creative pleasure of all of life and God. And so I guess I would just say that this story and the symbol makes sense for a worldview, but there's also alternate worldviews that are not mutually exclusive, but that can be kind of taken into consideration.
Yeah. Well, I would say the way to see it is that the story of the cross, like the story of the crucifixion, is a limit story. It's a story of the most compressed version of what self-sacrifice is. And then it also has in its story, especially in the crucifixion, it has resurrection as its result. And the resurrection is a glorious resurrection, right? It's no longer a resurrection in pain. And so if you understand the crucifixion and the resurrection together as a single story, then you will find what it is you're talking about. So think about a lover, for example. It's a great example that you brought up. It's like the lover who only thinks of his own pleasure will actually have less pleasure in the long run. But the lover who will, let's say, abstain to a certain extent, or will, how can I say, will delay their pleasure in order to discover the pleasure of the other, will find the surprise that in that little self-sacrifice, there's more pleasure on the other side. And it's kind of like that with your family too. It's like if you at first it's kind of like, oh, okay, so instead of, I don't know, like instead of playing video games, now I have to spend time with my kids. It's like, this is tough. I'm changing diapers, dude. This stinks. Like, this is rough. But then it's like that moment gives way to something like a resurrection, where all of a sudden it's like you discover this joy of having children that is beyond anything that you could have seen at the outset. So I think that if you understand the crucifixion and the resurrection together, it contains both of the elements you talk about. This kind of rapture, because there is the description even of Christ is also described as a lover, right? As there is this whole relationship between Christ and the soul, or Christ and the person, as ultimately being this erotic relationship too.